and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who will offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance that really help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I am your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I am an early years consultant and author. Now, throughout this series, we are going to be discussing the importance of nurturing social and emotional well-being in the early years. And we want to really inspire you with some guidance and resources that can really help support your practice. And today, I am delighted to introduce Debs Davies as our guest. Morning, Debs.
Morning, thank you.
How are you?
I'm very well this morning, thank you. How are you?
All good. Now, before we get stuck into what we're going to talk about, which is fascinating, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I am here to talk about inclusion and neurodivergence this morning because I am a late diagnosed ADHDer. I was diagnosed in midlife and it made a huge amount of sense to me. It made lots of the pieces of the jigsaw, things that were unexplained throughout all of my life, fit together. And as a result of that, I retrained to be an ADHD coach. I was already coaching before that, but I specialised in ADHD coaching. So that's what I do now after a 25 plus year career in the corporate setting, including a stint in education.
Interesting. And for full transparency, that's how we met, not in the corporate world, but I have 3 children, which lots of our listeners will know. And my middle child had an adult diagnosis of ADHD. And it also, like you said, made lots of the jigsaw pieces fall into place because he, all the way through school, there'd been something that we couldn't put our finger on, which was also complicated by the fact that he was an August-born boy in our current education system, and also he'd had a childhood illness. So lots of the things that didn't make sense, for want of a better term, we just kind of put down to, well, maybe it was because of that, or maybe it's because he's very young for his year. And he was tested for dyslexia, and he was tested for all sorts of things, and they all came back not negative, but everybody said there's just kind of something that's not right. And in terms of, I think, what lots of people's view of ADHD was, and for some people is, it's like throwing chairs across classrooms and swiping books off tables. And for him, he was a really compliant child. He didn't have lots of difficulty in being still. So it wasn't the kind of physical issue that he had. And for him, it was all to do with that other bit of the brain, which is about the organization, the attention, the retention. And so, again, as you said, when he got into his 20s and we started to connect the dots, that all kind of fell into place. And we have been on a medication route and are not on that route any longer, as you know, because the single biggest thing that has impacted on his life, and like significantly impacted on his life, has been the coaching around how you recognize and manage and explore your ADHD. And that's where you came in. So, you know, great thanks to you for the impact you've had on my family personally, but for, I think, people who are listening, and certainly for early years practitioners, we're going to dive a little bit into what is an inclusive approach, but also try and pull out some of the aspects of what ADHD can look like, and then think about how it's not all down to Ritalin, other medicines are available. It's often down to recognizing that what ADHD is, and being able to provide a framework to support children to flourish, which is perfectly possible, as you're an example of.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're absolutely right that the non-stereotypical signs of ADHD in children are so often missed, which is why there are so many later in life diagnosed people, because at some point, those people who are undiagnosed will come up against challenges that they don't know how to solve, or create issues or problems for them in their life in some way. And I feel very strongly that early intervention, early, spotting the signs of ADHD is such a critical piece of the jigsaw for people to be able to thrive with ADHD.
And I think that's where practitioners can really help parents as well, because what we do as parents and as practitioners is we then scaffold around our children. And if you've got a child that lives in your family house who's demonstrating their personality in any way, shape or form, and they have quirks in their personality, you just begin to think, well, that's just them, or little behaviours become very quickly accepted as that's how they behave. And so as a family, you just absorb that and you think, well, oh, they're not really good at organising themselves around that, so I'll put these things in place. Or, as we did a lot of, as parents do, I'll do it for them. Because actually, getting their clothes ready, getting your lunch sorted for school, getting your PE kit, they're always forgetting it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, again, for personal experience, it's just much easier for that morning rush with 3 kids if I just do it. So we realised we'd done a lot of subconscious scaffolding that actually was not helping him to manage his ADHD, because we didn't know he had ADHD, but enabling it actually not to be kind of tackled. And I think if practitioners in settings can get better at understanding what ADHD is and seeing it through a wider lens, then you can start to have those conversations with parents where you say, right, in this space, I'm seeing this. Is this reflected at home? If so, not diagnosing children with ADHD, but if this is a habit or a trait, here are some things we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the scaffolding issue, I think, is really, really key. Because, of course, at some point, when parents aren't there to scaffold, the child or the young adult, usually at that point, doesn't then have those skills because they haven't developed them early in life. So, for example, when people with ADHD go to university, for example, there is something like a 1 in 4 dropout rate in that first year. And how it's often talked about is that they kind of run into the wall. And what that means is that they kind of leave their parents, leave the structure of that home environment or the education establishment they've been in, and actually are left without that support and without those skills to actually be able to undertake the work that they need to do. So at some point, that scaffolding can become an issue.
We see that, I think, in schools at points of transition. So, when I think back to children who are entering things like nursery or reception for the first time, and again, all of those frameworks have been taken away and they're replaced by a different set. And I think sometimes as practitioners, we are unconscious enablers, because again, you get a class of 30 children and you just think, right, well, oh, that's how you behave. But then also, I think, and I know I'm glad this is changing, a lot of the behaviour management techniques that are employed by schools that link to how a group of children respond really don't work well for neurodivergent children. So they then push even harder against those, which means that they then become othered or outliers. So from very early on, you can get to children who are just perceiving the world through a slightly different lens, who become outliers within their community, classroom community. And actually, if we just shifted that lens a little bit as adults and were a little bit more inclusive because of the knowledge that we had, we could enable those children better.
I think there's some key and often very small changes that can be made in that early years setting that fundamentally changes the course of a neurodivergent child's life, certainly subsequently in education and as they go into employment too. Totally agree.
And I know we'll tackle more of this later on, but in terms of people listening to this, I'd probably think, well, how do I know? And often, not always, certainly not in the case of my particular child, but certainly children that I came into contact with across my education experience, children were labelled as the naughty child. And of course, as soon as you've earned that label, even if it's subconsciously by the adults and the other children around you. I mean, I know I go into hundreds of schools and often children will say to me, oh, so-and-so, he's a naughty boy or she's a naughty girl. And you think, well, if you're 3 or 4 and you've already, I say, or even it comes up in conversation, rather than saying, that's my friend or whatever, it's the fact that's the label you choose to attach to that child. Then that you begin then also to become the labels that you've been given. So sometimes I think we see, not always, but children who are neurodivergent because they sit outside of the expected norm as naughty. and therefore we treat them in a particular way. Is there anything where could practitioners start with thinking about that differently?
Well, I think there are a couple of points, because you're absolutely right. Children do get labelled as the naughty child. And of course, it's not that they then start to live down to people's expectations. It's that confirmation bias then starts to exist within the practitioners too. So what starts to happen is that all of their positive traits, all of their strengths, all of their good behaviours get filtered out and unacknowledged. And that, of course, leads to that increasing cycle with the child of kind of going, well, why would I bother? Yeah. Because I'm unseen over here where I'm doing well, and actually there's an over-focus over here where I'm actually really struggling. And I think that the real kind of the shift in understanding that I would like to see is that presenting behaviour is not actually the problem in itself. That presenting behaviour is a symptom of what the problem and what the challenge is. So typically things that people will get into trouble for at school are speaking before they put their hand up, talking in class,
wriggling on the carpet, shuffling.
Yeah. And actually, if you see that through a neurodivergent lens or a neuro kind of affirming lens, then children with ADHD in particular often need to move to be able to focus, and it helps them to focus. So if a child is typically, something that's more commonly known is that a child will kind of shake their knee. And of course, you kind of see that, because as I'm doing it now to demonstrate it, you can see my whole body moving. And so, that might irritate people, or it might be very, very visible. But actually, if the practitioner is saying, Johnny, don't shake your knee, the child then has to take all of its attention away from the learning towards their knee to stop their knee from shaking. Yeah. And actually what's happening is that in doing so, they're actually paying less attention. Yeah. So that whole kind of, you have to sit still to pay attention is not true for neurodivergent kids.
I think in truth, that kind of sitting still to pay attention is not true for any children. And there are lots of things that we do especially in early years. There's a big push around how compliance is seen as you're a good practitioner if you can get children to behave, and to behave means to sit and listen. But actually, if I think about when I'm listening effectively, rarely are you sitting up straight with your back straight with your legs crossed on a hard floor, listening to one person talk at you all the time. Often you'll be relaxed or moving about or lying down, and good listening comes from a place where you're interested, but B, you're engaged. But if we are constantly saying, like you're saying, sit still, stop wriggling. When we do any kind of teaching or any gathering, it's always come together, sit down, sit in your allocated space. Mm-hmm. Don't mess with the person next to you. Sit up straight, eyes on me. And you're right, all of those things, even in a developing brain, mean that I'm focusing on my legs, my back, my arms, the person next to me, the adult. And if my brain doesn't work in that way, then I'm also associating every time I come and sit with you, it's miserable, because I've got to just be thinking about these things rather than actually getting the joy of the thing that you're talking about. Yeah. So part of this for me, not just for neurodivergent children, but especially for them, is about really questioning some of the stereotypes around what is best practice in an early years setting, and having 30 children or 20 children or 10 children sit still to mean that they're listening is not a truth.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the people I trained with, for example, needed to move to focus, and so wrote a whole book in a rocking chair because they needed movement to focus. Yeah. And they couldn't have done it otherwise. And I think that's a really good example of why that kind of compliance is absolutely not necessary. Eye contact actually is a really, really important one too, because it's a kind of a social norm for us to make eye contact. But actually, for most of us, when we're thinking about what we're talking about, our eyes will actually be all over the place anyway. And also, particularly for somebody who's autistic, for example, eye contact is not necessarily something that is either easy or desirable for them. Yeah. and even myself, if I was, I'm looking at you now, but if I was listening to you give a presentation or a talk, I would probably be looking down. I may even be looking out the window, because actually, otherwise I might be distracted by, there might be a cat going past your window, or if we're in a work environment, a notification of your email popping up on your screen as you were showing me a presentation. All of that is incredibly distracting for me. I actually focus better if I'm not looking at that, because I know I can't be distracted. And I think it's that understanding that, this is not about children being non-compliant. It's actually about what do we need to help people to be effective learners.
And I think that also, we'll talk about this later, links the environment that we put children in. I think, again, for all children, and it's just more extreme for those that are neurodivergent, if we're in spaces that are full of very patterned, brightly coloured, dangly things that are blown in the wind, if you've got umbrellas over your water tray, if you've got laminated labels hanging from the ceiling, all of those things, very patterned rugs, again, a lot of earlier settings, and they cost an awful lot of money. And, I'm not saying you're a bad person if you've got one, but those rugs where they've got, lots of them have got insects on or flowers, and they're usually used as a mechanism for find an insect and sit in it, or find a flower and sit in it. But actually they're in primary colours, they're really bright. It means that within a children's eye line, you've got things like coloured oilcloths that are over tables, all the different patterns on, things dangling from the ceiling. All of that just plays havoc with your developing brain. Yeah. And not saying that your classroom needs to look like the inside of a Weetabix packet, but it's about that idea that you focus on the things that are important and give them precedence, and try and kill some of the noise, whether it be visual noise or auditory noise, just to allow people to concentrate.
Absolutely, because particularly for a neurodivergent child as well, because we can very easily be overstimulated by those environments, and that really inhibits learning too. And it's also not just about the visual noise or the auditory noise. Sometimes it's about the texture and the feel, how something feels on your skin. All of those things, typically for somebody who's neurodivergent, they'll have a heightened sensitivity to all of those kinds of things. So again, like you say, it's not about saying, don't do any of it, or you're terrible if you do some of it. It's about, I think, recognizing that for some people that might be overstimulating or really off-putting or inhibiting their learning. And actually, what can you do instead? Is that actually you just tone it down a bit, or there's a space where it's not like that, or where there's a quiet time or a quiet space where people can get away from that so that they can regulate again, and that overstimulation actually just settles a bit.
So I think what we're kind of saying is, especially in education, from my experience, is that practitioners, through no fault of their own, have been trained to look at education through quite a limiting lens. Yeah. And so as we're getting lots more information, which we are, and people like you and podcasts like this that allow us to explore the difference that we know biologically and scientifically exists within children, rather than just their preference, means that if we can look through a less limiting lens, then we will see the uniqueness of children and create environments that value that uniqueness. But that is going to challenge some of the things that, certainly after 30 odd years of teaching, that I was told would be best practice for everyone. I think we're trying to break through that wall of there is no typical child and there is no ultimate best practice, like one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you, I think it's inadvertent, unintentional. I'm not a basher of, early years practitioners or medical practitioners, because simply that understanding hasn't been there until very, very recently. And, I think it's important to recognise that does require a big shift, not just in early years, but in, the medical profession in a number of other areas too. And that might take some time. And so, it doesn't serve us any purpose or any benefit to actually say, it's your fault that it's not there. It's an evolving understanding. And, my view is that as best we can engage people in that evolving understanding that we have and create an evolving change in the delivery of whatever service it is, whether it's education or medical care or what have you, then that, I think, is the most important thing for us to do.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's a brilliant place to end this first episode. So I think what we're going to talk about in the next episode is how we can unpick a little bit more about how ADHD might present itself in children in the early years, but also how we can create more inclusive environments. So don't forget to join us then. But for now, Debs, thank you for your fascinating insight. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our guest Debs for joining us and providing such valuable insights. Now, you've been listening to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Debs Davies. And if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and also access exclusive follow-up content, which includes ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.